In this lesson, we are going to talk about the difference between mediating and moderating variables, as well as touch on other extraneous variables. Most often in research, the cause and effect relationship between an independent and a dependent variable isn't necessarily a direct one, and there are intermediate steps that get us from the cause to the effect. Mediating variables are these intermediate steps that link the independent variable to the dependent variable. For example, think of a 3-year-old who asks a question and when given an answer, follows up with the question, why? He may do this over and over after each answer he is given. For example, he may ask, why did the dogs bark at the mailman? And when you explain that they don't like people coming to the front door, he may follow up with, why? And why again? In other words, he is getting at the mediating steps in between the mailman's presence and the dog's barking. Many times we know that one variable leads to another, but we may not know why. Mediating variables are the steps that come between an action and a response. For example, research has shown that observing others yawn often makes us yawn ourselves. However, the mediating variables between the cause and effect are unknown. Some suspect that mirror neurons in the brain, which help us learn to imitate the actions of others, may be a mediating variable. Your research may or may not be interested in these mediators. It all depends on the research question you are trying to answer. Moderating variables influence the relationship between an independent and a dependent variable. They can increase, decrease, or even reverse the relationship. Think back to grade school when you learned about the way the letters I and E interacted with each other when appearing next to each other in a word. You probably learned the rule I before E, meaning that when appearing next to each other, the letter I would always come before the letter E. However, there was one exception to that rule that modified the relationship between I and E, and that was when the letters came immediately after the letter C. I before E except after C. In this case, except after C is acting kind of like a moderating variable to the relationship between the letters I and E. Sometimes conflicting findings in research are the result of a hidden moderating variable. For example, when studying the effect of an audience on a person's performance, some studies found that an audience facilitated performance, while other studies found an audience actually inhibited performance. Finally, a new study found that the relationship between the two variables depended on the difficulty of the task being performed. If the task was an easy one, then an audience facilitated performance, and if the task was a difficult one, it inhibited performance. It should be remembered that moderating variables don't always completely reverse the relationship between two variables. Sometimes they increase the strength of the relationship, and sometimes they decrease it. There are other variables that can affect the cause and effect relationship between the independent and the dependent variables. Extraneous variables are variables that were not an intended part of the study, but that may, in fact, affect the results and contaminate the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. These variables are not measured by the researcher. An extraneous variable may be background noise in a study interested in how different music affects the effectiveness of studying. Or it may be differences in the time of day that participants take tests of attention after 2 different training programs. Or an extraneous variable could be a participant variable, such as gender, in an experiment in which participants judge the attractiveness of faces with different amounts of symmetry. Basically, an extraneous variable is any factor that adds noise to the relationship you are trying to study. Researchers do all they can to eliminate the impact of extraneous variables. In other words, they do what they can to control for them in some way. Oftentimes, they will make the testing situations of the two or more conditions or levels of the independent variable as similar to each other as possible, so that any unknown extraneous variables present are equally present, having an equal effect in all conditions. Other times, when potential extraneous variables can be identified, they are removed from the experiment altogether. Or, if an extraneous variable cannot be removed from the experiment, statistics are used to remove the effect of the variable from the numerical results. Many times, extraneous variables have no systematic effect on the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. However, sometimes these variables do systematically relate to the independent and dependent variables and can offer an alternative explanation for the results. In these cases, the extraneous variables are referred to as confounding variables. For example, say you are interested in whether or not eating breakfast affects performance on a memory task. IQ may be a confounding variable in this case, since simply having a higher IQ may improve a participant's performance on a memory task. So, to sum up, while the focus of research experiments is typically to study the relationship between independent and dependent variables, other factors can affect that relationship. Extraneous variables add noise to the relationship, and researchers try to avoid them or control for them. Confounding variables, a type of extraneous variable, systematically relate to the independent and/or the dependent variables, and do so by affecting their relationship with one another. Sometimes researchers are scientifically interested in these variables and design their experiments to better understand them. One type of variable, the moderating variable, modifies the relationship between the independent and dependent variables by increasing, decreasing, or reversing it. And finally, mediating variables don't necessarily affect the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. Rather, they are part of the causal chain between the two.